In August 1990, the Iraqi army crossed into Kuwait and seized the country in 4 hours. The government fled. The oil fields were occupied. Domestic bank accounts were frozen. For 7 months, Kuwait as a functioning state ceased to exist. The Kuwaiti government-in-exile, operating from Saudi Arabia, had one asset that Iraq couldn't touch: a fund, managed from an office in London. Founded in 1953, 8 years before Kuwait was even an independent country. That fund is the Kuwait Investment Authority, the KIA. It's the world's oldest sovereign wealth fund. As of 2026, it manages over $1 trillion in assets. And the story of how it was built, how it survived a war, and why the country that created it is now struggling to replicate its success anywhere else in its economy, is one of the most instructive stories in modern economic history. The Kuwait Investment Board was established on February 23, 1953. Kuwait wouldn't become an independent country for another 8 years. That timing is the first thing worth sitting with. Most sovereign wealth funds are created after a country has built its institutions, after independence, after a parliament, after a central bank. Kuwait built its investment vehicle before any of that. Understanding why Sheikh Abdullah Al Salem made that decision when he did is what separates Kuwait's story from every other Gulf state that discovered oil around the same time, and spent it. Commercial oil production in Kuwait began in 1946. By the early 1950s, the revenues were arriving faster than the government could sensibly deploy them domestically. The country's population was small, a few 100,000 people, and there were only so many roads, schools, and hospitals that could be built before the spending became wasteful. Sheikh Abdullah looked at the surplus and drew a conclusion that very few resource-rich governments have drawn at that moment of abundance. The oil is finite. The money it generates is not infinite. It needs to go somewhere it can compound. The Kuwait Investment Board was set up in London, not Kuwait City, specifically because London was the world's leading financial center and because the board needed access to global capital markets that didn't yet exist in the Gulf. Its mandate was direct: invest surplus oil revenue in international financial assets and generate a return that would eventually substitute for oil income when the reserves ran out. In 1976, 15 years after independence, the Kuwaiti government formalized the structure with an Amiri decree creating the Future Generations Fund. The rule was specific. A minimum of 10% of all state revenues would be transferred to the FGF every year, to be invested abroad for the benefit of Kuwaitis who hadn't been born yet. The fund couldn't be touched for domestic spending. It was legally ring-fenced against the political pressures that consume most resource windfalls. The General Reserve Fund sat alongside it, the fiscal buffer that received the rest of the oil revenues and paid the government's day-to-day bills. 2 pools, one for now, one for later. The one for later couldn't be rated to solve short-term budget problems. That structural discipline is the entire reason the KIA exists as a $1 trillion fund today rather than a depleted account. Kuwait built the world's first sovereign wealth fund before it was a country. The legal ring-fencing of the Future Generations Fund is the single decision that separates it from every Gulf neighbor that spent the same windfall. The KIA is structured around 2 funds with completely different mandates, and understanding the distinction is what makes the institution legible. Most coverage of Kuwait's sovereign wealth focuses on the total assets number, now past $1 trillion, without explaining what the 2 funds actually do differently. That distinction matters because it's what determines how the KIA behaves in a crisis, how it invests across market cycles, and why it's been able to maintain a patient investment approach for 70 years while governments around it changed policy every time oil prices moved. The General Reserve Fund is Kuwait's day-to-day fiscal account. It receives all oil revenues, all government income, and it pays for everything Kuwait spends domestically: public sector salaries, infrastructure, subsidies, the welfare state. When oil prices fall and the government runs a deficit, the GRF absorbs it. It also holds Kuwait's domestic investments, stakes in Kuwaiti banks, telecom companies, and regional assets. The Future Generations Fund is structurally different. It invests exclusively abroad in global equities, fixed income, real estate, private equity, and infrastructure. It holds stakes in over 90 listed companies globally. As of 2025, that includes 5.6% of Mercedes-Benz Group in Germany, 5.4% of BlackRock in the United States, significant positions in Asian equity markets, and a portfolio of European infrastructure assets. The FGF doesn't interact with Kuwait's domestic budget. It compounds offshore and reports back in decades, not quarters. The KIA doesn't publish detailed accounts. It never has. The total assets figure circulating publicly, now past $1 trillion, is an estimate from the Sovereign Wealth Fund Institute and other trackers, not a disclosed balance sheet. This opacity has been consistent since 1953 and is deliberate. An institution managing a country's long-term savings across global markets has no reason to advertise its positions, and every reason not to. The fund's behavior in markets is its disclosure. What the KIA does disclose, through its governance structure, is that its board is chaired by the Minister of Finance, includes the Energy Minister, the Central Bank Governor, and 5 private sector specialists. Investment decisions are guided by internal teams and long-term external relationships with the world's largest institutional asset managers. It is not a trading operation. It is the world's largest patient capital institution. The KIA's power comes not from what it buys, but from what it never sells. 70 years of compounding in the FGF, legally insulated from domestic politics, built a $1 trillion position that no oil price crash or budget crisis can touch. At 2 a.m. on August 2, 1990, Iraqi armored divisions crossed Kuwait's northern border. By 6 a.m., they had reached Kuwait City. By the time the international community had organized a response, Kuwait's domestic economy had been seized. Its oil fields were under Iraqi control, and its government was on a plane to Saudi Arabia. This chapter is the stress test every sovereign wealth fund is theoretically designed for, and the one almost none of them has ever actually faced. What happens to a country's wealth fund when the country ceases to exist? For Kuwait, the answer is what justifies the entire architecture that Sheikh Abdullah built in 1953. The fund wasn't just saving money for future generations. It was the backup state. The Kuwait Investment Office in London, the KIA's international arm, became Kuwait's de facto Ministry of Finance. The government in exile in Saudi Arabia had no access to domestic revenues, no functioning central bank, and no ability to collect taxes. It had one source of operating capital, the assets held in the FGF and managed from London. What followed was the most unusual financial operation in sovereign wealth fund history. The KIO organized the transfer of funds from global accounts to the Kuwaiti government in exile. It coordinated Kuwait's contribution to the multinational coalition that would eventually liberate the country. It paid for Kuwaiti citizens abroad, sustained diplomatic missions, and kept the legal structure of the Kuwaiti state functioning across 7 months of occupation. The price was steep. By 1993, 2 years after liberation, the KIA had been drawn down from roughly $100 billion to between $40 and $50 billion. The difference had paid Kuwait's share of coalition costs, funded the government in exile for 7 months, and covered the initial phase of post-war reconstruction, including the extinguishing of 749 oil well fires that Iraqi forces had set ablaze as they retreated. Every single fire was out within a year. If you find this kind of breakdown useful, subscribing takes 2 seconds, and it means the next video finds you automatically. Thanks. So, Kuwait liberated, oil wells extinguished. KIA drawn from $100 billion to $40 billion. What happens next is the compounding story that almost no one tells correctly. Kuwait used its sovereign wealth fund to fund a war, a liberation, and a reconstruction. The KIA lost $50 billion in 3 years. Then it started building back. Oil production capacity was back to pre-war levels by 1993. Revenues resumed flowing into both the GRF and the FGF. The KIA's post-war rebuild was one of the fastest recoveries of a depleted sovereign wealth fund ever recorded. The reason this chapter matters is that the post-war period is where Kuwait's investment decisions became visible, and where we can trace exactly how a fund goes from $40 billion to over $1 trillion across 30 years. The specific bets made in this period, the institutions backed, the crises absorbed, and the patience maintained through multiple oil price collapses are the granular story behind the headline number. The KIA's post-war investment philosophy didn't change after 1991. It deepened. The fund had just demonstrated in the most extreme possible way why long-duration, internationally diversified assets matter. Domestic assets can be seized, London accounts cannot. The lesson reinforced the FGF's offshore-only mandate and pushed the fund toward larger, more liquid global positions that could be accessed under any geopolitical scenario. The investment record across the 1990s and 2000s shows a consistent pattern: large strategic stakes in globally systemically important institutions. In 2006, the KIA invested $720 million in the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China, one of the earliest Gulf sovereign fund commitments to Chinese financial markets. In 2008, during the global financial crisis, when Citigroup and Merrill Lynch were facing collapse, the KIA moved. In January 2008, while most investors were exiting financial stocks, the KIA purchased $3 billion in preferred Citigroup stock and participated in Merrill Lynch's $6.6 billion capital raise, with an estimated $2 billion commitment. Both banks were under severe stress. Both were offering preferred shares with significant dividend yields to attract emergency capital. By December 2009, the KIA had sold its Citigroup position for $4.1 billion, a $1.1 billion return in under 2 years. In 2009, the KIA invested $750 million in BlackRock. It currently holds 5.4% of the company. BlackRock has since become the world's largest asset manager with over $10 trillion under management. The KIA's BlackRock stake alone, held for 15 years, has compounded at a rate that would have been difficult to achieve through any other single investment. In 2010, it invested $800 million in the Agricultural Bank of China and $1 billion in AIA Group, before selling the AIA position for $3.4 billion in July 2025. The structure that made this possible is the same structure Sheikh Abdullah designed in 1953. The FGF couldn't be rated. Its 10% annual inflow continued through low oil prices, political crises, and the post-2014 oil price collapse. The discipline of the ring fencing, holding through every cycle rather than liquidating under pressure, is what separates the KIA's trajectory from sovereign funds that have been drawn on repeatedly for domestic fiscal needs. The KIA went from $40 billion to $1 trillion in 30 years through one mechanism, compounding inside a legally insulated structure that politicians couldn't touch. That's the entire story. Here is the paradox at the center of Kuwait's story. The Kuwait Investment Authority is one of the best performing sovereign wealth funds in the world. Patient, disciplined, globally diversified, and now managing over $1 trillion. The Kuwaiti domestic economy, by contrast, is the least diversified in the Gulf. Oil still accounts for roughly 90% of Kuwait's government revenue and 43% of GDP. The non-oil private sector is small, underdeveloped, and heavily dependent on government contracts. This matters for anyone tracking Gulf geopolitics because Kuwait's situation is the clearest available demonstration of a specific failure mode. A country can build a brilliant sovereign wealth fund and simultaneously fail to diversify its underlying economy. The fund's success and the economic failure are not contradictions. They're connected. The structural explanation runs through Kuwait's parliament. Before the May 2024 suspension of the National Assembly, Kuwait's elected legislature had for decades functioned as a powerful brake on economic reform. Ministers were routinely subjected to hostile questioning over public contracts. Two major reform projects, a $17.4 billion joint venture between Dow Chemical and Kuwait's petrochemical industries company, canceled in December 2008, and a new Al-Zour refinery, canceled in March 2009, were blocked by parliamentary opposition. International investors learned that Kuwait's political system made large-scale economic transformation structurally difficult. The KIA's success, paradoxically, reduced the urgency of domestic reform. When a country has a $1 trillion savings vehicle generating returns that can, in principle, fund the government indefinitely, the political pressure to build a non-oil private sector is lower. Why restructure a welfare state, reduce subsidies, or introduce income tax when the sovereign wealth fund can cover the deficit? Kuwait's fiscal position, cushioned by the KIA's returns, absorbed the consequences of the reforms that never happened. The 2024 suspension of parliament created a window. In March 2025, the cabinet approved Kuwait's first public debt law since 2017, enabling sovereign bond issuance of up to $97 billion over 50 years. The legislation had been blocked by parliamentary opposition for years. With the National Assembly suspended, the executive moved. Whether this produces genuine economic diversification or simply funds a larger version of the same oil-dependent state is the open question. Kuwait's position is instructive beyond its own borders. The KIA proves that patient capital, properly structured, compounds across generations, regardless of geopolitical disruption. Kuwait's domestic economy proves that a sovereign wealth fund cannot substitute for economic reform. It can only delay the reckoning. The countries watching Kuwait most carefully are the ones whose oil revenues are declining and whose sovereign funds are the only buffer between them and a structural fiscal crisis. Kuwait built the best sovereign wealth fund in the world. It didn't build the economy to go with it. The KIA bought Kuwait time. Whether Kuwait uses the time is still unanswered. Kuwait's paradox: a world-class sovereign fund alongside a domestic economy that hasn't diversified, is not unique to Kuwait. Every Gulf state that built its fiscal system on oil revenues faces the same long-run structural question. When the oil era ends, what replaces it? Qatar looked at that question and gave a completely different answer. Kuwait built a passive wealth fund, patient capital compounding offshore. Qatar built an LNG empire, active infrastructure that embedded itself into the energy systems of Japan, South Korea, India, and Europe. And in 2022, when Russia cut gas supplies to Europe, Qatar used that embedded position to make European governments fly to Doha and ask for help. The leverage wasn't financial, it was physical. 100 LNG tankers, 14 liquefaction trains, and 25-year contracts that Europe had never signed. The previous video on this channel maps exactly how Qatar built that position. The North Field discovery in 1971 that nobody wanted, the decision to bet everything on LNG when the technology barely existed, and the 27-year contract with China's Sinopec signed in 2023 during the same European energy crisis that reveals exactly where Qatar thinks power is moving for the next 3 decades. By the end of it, you'll have a structural read on why Qatar left OPEC in 2019, and why the Gulf state that looks smallest on a map has built the most consequential energy position of any country its size in history.